Hello, everybody, and welcome to another monthly installation of this show that I call Beer School. My name is Andrew Mason, aka Brewer A, and at least once a month, I try to get together with you guys and talk about a specific topic about beer. Sometimes it's just us hanging out and having beers and talking about what we're drinking, maybe a certain style. And sometimes I bring in a special guest, somebody from the industry. In the past, we've talked in deep depth about hops with Stan Hieronymus. We've spoken with Lindsay Barr from New Belgium about sensory. And this week, I've invited Caleb Michalke, who runs Sugar Creek Malting in Indiana. And we're going to talk about malt and malting. Caleb, thank you for coming and welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, why don't you give us a little bit of background on yourself and on your farm and on the malt house?
Okay, well, I grew up in Lebanon, Indiana, which is about 30 minutes north of Indianapolis. Um, Grew up on a farm. We raised hogs and grain, and I quickly learned that I did not want to raise hogs for the rest of my life. So I actually left the farm for a few years and ended up teaching for a couple of years and realized that wasn't the path for me either, and kind of wanted to get back to the farm. And got into home brewing while I was away, and kind of really enjoyed that industry. Got to know some brewers, and thought, let's get back into agriculture, but kind of do what ingredients go into beer, and kind of I started looking into that, and there was just nobody around in Indiana making malt. There were a couple of guys doing hops, and I looked into that and really didn't think that was going to be the avenue for me to go down. Um, so then I started doing some research into malting and realized that there was really nobody doing it. And so we decided, you know what, we have the combine, we have the grain bins, we just need to build a malt house. So back in 2014, we started building the malt house. Then 2015, we started actually malting, and we're about 2.5 years into it now. So we make base malts and smoked malts, and hopefully, fingers crossed, we'll be making some roasted malts in 2018. So we'll see how that goes. So
Very cool. Well, we can get into the differences between all that in a little bit. But let's start at the basics. We have talked about malt a little bit in the past here on Beer School. In the very first episode when we did our beer 101, we talked about the four main ingredients of beer and how all of those come to the table in terms of making beer. But let's start real simple and get back into the definition of malt and what its purpose is in beer. So basically, the grains that we're going to be using to make beer with are going to be malted grains. If you take just raw unmalted grains, they're not going to make beer because we need to get the sugars from the grains dissolved into a liquid so that the yeast can eat up those sugars and turn that into alcohol and CO2. And the malting process takes those grains, mostly barley, but there's certainly plenty of other grains that we can use too, but mostly barley, and it basically starts the germination process, halts the germination process, and then gets those grains prepared so that the brewer can use it. Like I said, barley is going to be the majority grain that makes up the most of beers. But you can malt wheat. You can malt nearly any grain, right? There's no.
yeah, yeah,
If you have the time and the patience, there's not anything that
yeah.
you can't malt.
The end results and how many enzymes, how much alpha amylase and diastatic power you're going to get is going to vary. But yeah, you can malt anything you want to malt basically. So, but yeah, I mean, as you were saying, think of what grain is, what a kernel of barley is in nature. I mean, it's the stored starch for the plant to be able to get above, get its shoot above the ground and start doing photosynthesis. And so it has to have that starch to be able to get that shoot to shoot up through the dirt. And so that's basically what we're trying to do in the malt house, and is to wake up those enzymes and start breaking down the sugars for the brewers then to use for brewing. So yeah, I mean it's basically just a very simple process of getting a grain wet and letting it germinate and going from there. But it's step by step is very detailed and specific per grain that you're doing.
So let's talk about the malt process in general. We've looked at some of these photos before, but let me pull these back up again. This is, like I said in a previous episode. Let me jump over here. Oh, that's not what we want. What happened? What happened? Let's get that fixed. Oh no! Our pictures. I spoke too soon on those technical difficulties board. Every single time that I do this, there's one problem or another, and it never ceases to amaze me that something's wrong. Let me delete that. Let me bring it back up. Let me see if I can get this. If we can get this going again. Media source 2. Nope, I want window capture. Always have to do this stuff on the fly because always goofing stuff up. There we go. That looks much better. Okay, so
You have to tell me what we're looking at
Yep.
here, but I can't see it.
so let me fix this real quick. There we go. Okay, so we're looking at the outside of a very old malt house that I think still physically exists. It's called Jefferson Junction, and it used to be owned by the Laddish family. It was called Laddish Maltings, and it was a big old school malt house that churned out tons of malted barley that primarily fed Milwaukee because the big old breweries were there and they needed a lot of malt to brew beer with. And so as we jump in here, oh, that's one of Caleb's photos. Let's see if we go back to, let's go to the interior here. Okay, so what we're looking at is a very big steeping tank. And I'm going to try to tweak this just a little bit more because the crop doesn't look too good, and we can make this look much nicer. So Caleb, walk us through step by step for the malting process while I'm tweaking these.
Yeah, no, you're
real
fine.
quick.
So, like I was saying earlier, as a maltster, all we're trying to do is trick this grain into thinking that it's spring and it's ready for it to grow and ready for it to get that sprout out. Because, like I said earlier, the starch is just it's a complex starch, and brewer's yeast can't digest that. So we need to wake up the alpha amylase, we need to wake up the beta amylase, and have it start breaking down the cell walls, the proteins, the beta glucans, everything that you need to break down for the brewing process. So to do that, we need to trick the grain into thinking, hey, it's spring, it's ready to grow. So the first step in doing that is getting it wet, acting as a rain coming down on the kernel. So yeah, if you have a big, I don't know what you have pulled up now, but we have big steep tanks. Ours are what we have in our facility, which is a very small facility. We have 1,000-gallon. They basically look like conical fermenters. Put the grain in there, put water on top of it, fill it up, and then you have a bubbler system inside of it to keep oxygen to it because each kernel is a living kernel. Malting barley isn't accepted underneath 96% germination. So we have to have it. Basically, every single kernel in there has to grow for it to be malting barley. So it's alive. It's a living kernel, and we add the oxygen to it so that it doesn't drown, basically. We go through 3 different wet phases, and that depends on what variety you're doing and what if it's barley or wheat or rye. And so different malt houses have different schedules as far as steeping. But what we do is we go through a first steep, and that's to get the kernel up to about 35% moisture, and then we drain the water, let it sit for about 12 hours with the vacuum sucking out the CO2 that is accumulated at the bottom because these grains start working and they start producing CO2. You're sucking that out off the bottom, so that they don't again suffocate and die. And then again, you will get to put more water in there for another, our first steeping is about 4 to 6 hours. Others are longer. A lot of other malt houses do it a little bit longer. Our first steep is 4 to 6 hours, then 12 hours dry. Second steep is about 6 hours. Again, bubbling throughout the entire time to keep oxygen to the grain, and then another 12 hours dry, sucking off CO2, extracting that, and then at the end, we're trying to get up to, depending on what we're making. So like a Pilsner malt, we shoot for about 43% moisture, compared to a Vienna or Munich malt, which is about 47% moisture. So that final steep is where we make that final cut on what percent moisture is going into the grain.
And each successive steeping step, you're getting like one certain percentage more absorption of water in those kernels. Is that the idea?
Correct. Yeah, you don't want to, if you just do it all at once. If you go back and read some of the old, and we'll get into this a little bit later, but if you go back, and there's not a whole lot of material as far for malting. You can't go out and buy 50 books like you can for brewing. There's about 2 or 3 books that really go into depth in malting, and a lot of them are pretty old. But yeah, if you go back in a time, back in the day, they would just do like one steep. They would just let it sit. But giving that air rest, and letting the grain kind of rebound allows it to pick up moisture faster on the next steep, and then the next steep. If you just did one steep, it would drown it almost, and it would kind of go in a not dormancy, but it would slow it down, and you'd have some problems with that. So yeah, doing that air rest kind of lets the grain kind of absorb that water, get some oxygen around it, and then you go back into the next steep, and yeah, you work your way up to around 45%. But like I said earlier, depending on what style of malt you're making in the end.
And this photo that we're looking at is a extremely large steeping tank, when you can see the churning on the surface of the water where they're bubbling oxygen up
Right.
through, or air up through it. But
Yep.
this was at this particular malt facility. Like I said, it was enormous. It was one of many steeping tanks, and this one was about 20 feet across. So really, really large, and they had a whole bunch of these in a row. And so after the steep is done, and they have the specific percentage of water absorbed into the individual barley kernels, then what's our next step?
So the next step is germination. And like I said, each one of these steps are super simple when you think about them. It's just the fine detail of getting everything exactly correct. So steeping, you get the grain wet. I mean, that's all you have to do. Germination, you put it out onto a floor and let it germinate. So basically every malt house now, every large scale malt house now is a pneumatic system with big augers that turn the grain. Because during germination, what we're doing is the roots are actually coming out of the grain. They're gonna get about a quarter of an inch long, really small roots, coming out at the end of the kernel, and those roots will actually grow together and make a solid mass if you don't go in there and break it up. So if you see the old pictures of floor malting, which is still done in some malt houses in Europe, and then some new craft malt houses here in the United States, floor malting, you got to go in and you pull a rake and break those kernels up, and that's what you're trying to do, is you're trying to break the kernels up, number one. Number two, allowing that to break up allows the kernel to cool a little bit, because as it's germinating, it's putting off heat. But now modern time, and that's in modern malting, and what we have here at our malt house, we have a pneumatic system, which basically means we've got a false bottom floor, and we're pushing air up through it, so we can have ours is about 2 feet deep, our germination bed. Some malt houses, big, large-scale malt houses can go up to 4 to 5 feet deep if they've got enough CFMs to push the air up through it.
Yeah, and this picture that I'm showing right now is a malt or a germination bed that is about it was probably about 20 yards wide and about 100 or more yards deep. It was really, really giant. I'm not sure how much tonnage you would be able to fit into one of those, but it's huge. Yeah. And when you walk into a facility like that, it's humid and it's dark for the most part,
Yeah.
and
Yep.
it's pretty overwhelming because there's just not very many opportunities that you get to see something like that on that kind of scale. And we'll get
Yeah.
into we'll show the pictures from Caleb's facility as soon as we get through these, and we'll go back through and compare the scales between the two.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, basically, so for germination, you're letting it germinate, and it depends on what grain you're doing. So a lot of 2-row barley now. The modern varieties of 2-row take anywhere from 3 to 5 is really pushing it. 3 to 4 days really is a good germination period for, and that allows full modification. You're breaking down all your cell walls, you're breaking down your proteins, you're waking up your alpha, you're waking up your beta, all the amylases that you're needing. So about 3 to 4 days, and then when it gets to, like, for our white wheat that we malt, that takes about 5 days. For rye, it takes about 6 or 7 days. So it really depends, what you're malting, how long you're germinating. And then we go in.
We should explain real quick. When you say things like amylase, we're talking about the enzymes that are naturally occurring in the barley that are the ones that will be converting the starches into sugars. Correct?
Correct. Yeah, yeah. That's basically what all the goal is of a maltster is waking up all the enzymes that natural enzymes inside of a kernel that break down the sugars, that break down the proteins, that break down the everything that you want to break down for brewing. That's all we're trying to do, is just wake those up and get those kernels. If you ever chew on a barley before it's malted, you can't break into it. It's really tough. It's really hard. And then for malt, as anybody that's chewed on a kernel of malt, it's almost like a Rice Krispie. It should just pop right open. And that's all because of all those enzymes that we woke up during germination.
All right. So we've got to germination, and this picture that we're looking at right now is actually right as the malt was. So the germination beds are situated immediately underneath the steeping tanks, so that they could just physically drop gravity fed from one to the next.
That'd be nice.
Yeah, they would get turned with really large augers, yep, as Caleb was saying, and you turn those barley kernels until the germination starts. And you can see I have a picture of my hand with a whole bunch of barley kernels on here, and you can see all these tiny little rootlets that are coming out. And they're about the length of the kernel, but they have to keep getting moved because it turns into this giant rat's nest of kernels if they don't get regularly turned over. And then,
that is a pain after that happens. If you don't rake it soon enough, there have been some varieties we get in and they grow a little bit faster and they grow overnight, and then the next morning you're sitting there we're sitting here by hand just breaking up every little glob of malt to try to break it up and let the air flow through it. So yeah.
And then what Caleb had just described in terms of the softness of the grain, I took one barley kernel and just squished it in my fingers, so it's really, really soft at this point. But you can't use barley that's that soft to make beer with. We've got to go through the process of getting all of that water that we've just got into the barley back out again. So let me skip forward here, and then this was a picture.
So what you were describing with the pinching of the finger, that's called in our industry, it's called the maltster's thumb, and that's a good indication. So back in the day, before we had technology to measure, and really even today, it's still done. You go in there and if you squeeze the kernel between your finger, and it leaves a nice chalky covering across your thumb and your index finger, then that's a good. Then you know that the kernel has been modified. If you only go like a 2-day germ and you grab the same kernel and try to squeeze it, it's going to be a gummy kind of just ball. It kind of balls up and it doesn't break up. After 4 days to 5 days germination, after the kernel has totally modified and broken down all the cell walls and everything, it should leave this really chalky white kind of cover over your finger. So yeah, that's a good thing to talk about. Is the maltster's thumb, that's what they called it. So.
And then this picture that I'm showing right now was one barley kernel that had fallen out of the bed, and it's already grown a rootlet that's about 4 inches long, and it has a sprout that's going up too that's about the same length. Showing you how highly modified some of these newer barley varieties are, or modern barley varieties, where as soon as it hits that germination process, that plant is ready to start growing,
Yeah,
and
it is.
you need to
Yeah,
jump in there as the maltster right away and tell it to knock that shit off.
yeah. I mean, yeah. If you let it go, or if you get the moisture too high in the steep tank. I mean, if something happens in the steep tank and the moisture gets too high, you'll have sprouts coming out the other end, and obviously you don't want that. You're losing all of your everything that you just worked for as a maltster. You're losing out that sprout. So all those sugars are going out that sprout. So. And yeah, if you don't clean up the stuff that you spilled, it's going to sprout within a few days. Back in the day, if you read some old literature, it took 21 days to a lot of 11 to 21 days to malt grain. Now it's down to 4 days germination and 2 days steeping, so about a week. So the modern varieties really have completely streamlined everything, and over breeding over a couple hundred years of selection. It's pretty amazing.
And we'll talk more later about what it means, or what your end result is when you're talking about modern varieties versus some heritage varieties too. Let's see where we're at with some photos here. So
all right, so yeah, you started going into the kiln, so I should probably talk about that a little bit.
Okay, so let's jump over to your photos.
Okay.
I think the first one here is we have some square beds, and it looks like some cylindrical steeping tanks.
Yeah. So those are our steep tanks. Like I said, they're 1,000-gallon steep tanks. So basically, our batch size for finished malt is about 3,000 pounds per batch is what we do. So we'll put it into those steep tanks. Like I said, we have bubblers in there, and then we have different conveyor belts that we can move from the steep tank into the germination floors. We pump in fog, humidified air underneath the germination floors to keep, because if you don't do that, the bottom like couple inches of the grain dries out, and then you're just losing your germination at that point. So you got to keep that grain wet for it to keep growing. And then we'll go in with pitchforks and actually rake those floors, because we don't have big augers that go and do it for us, which would be nice, but we don't have that yet. So we have to go in there with a pitchfork literally every day and turn the grain by hand. Which is nice because we can really inspect each, our germination beds are 9 by 12 is what they are. So we can really inspect each inch of it and see how things are growing here, how things are in kind of as it's going through the process, really kind of fine tune it. So yeah, I think that's our germination room, I guess, that you're looking at.
Yeah,
so.
let's go. And then these are some photos of you. So here's Caleb on the left on the top, and on the right on the top is Todd Hogg, who works at Three Floyds in Munster, Indiana. And then on the bottom here is the guy on the right giving the finger is Chris Bogus, who's the head brewer there at Three Floyds. And then Jesse, right?
Yeah, Jesse. Jesse Faber.
You're one of your main guys down there, and they're in the beds with the pitchforks. They're turning malt.
Yeah. So that's how we do it every single day. It can be a one-person job. It's nice when it's a two-person job. We can both get in there and kind of knock it out. But yeah, it's a lot of times if we're all busy, it's one guy gets in there and turns the grain by hand. But yeah,
and then
it's a lot of labor, a lot of love that goes into it.
One of our friends in chat, Board, is kind of joking. He says, "There's no hairnets. I'm kind of disappointed." But grain actually is a pretty dirty thing, and you're talking about something that comes from a field, gets soaked in water. There's not really, I guess, maybe tell us a little bit about cleanliness, quote unquote, in terms of grain and malt, because malt's pretty dirty.
Yeah, malt is still considered a raw product. I mean, it's still going to be boiled during the mashing produce, unless it's going into food. Then it's a whole other set of rules that you have to deal with. But malt going into brewing process or into the distilling process is still a raw product, and during that hour boil process that you go through, you're going to kill anything that's going on in there. So yeah, there are little microorganisms that cling coming from the field into the malt house. They're still on the outside of the kernel of the grain, and During the kilning process, we kill most of those off. But yeah, I mean, you go into big mega malt houses all over the world, and and even the floor malting, they're malting on concrete. I mean, it's not stainless steel, it's nothing like that. What we are here, stainless steel, so that we can clean in between batches. But yeah, I mean, it's like I said, it's a raw product. It doesn't have to be a food grade product, is what I'm saying, I guess. So.
All right, so let's get back to the process. So we have our germinated grain, and it is right at the point of germination that we don't want the barley kernels to go any further. So what is the next step?
So the next step is putting it in the kiln. So the kilning process basically goes through two phases. It'll go through a drying phase and then a curing phase. The drying phase is basically just to get the grain, and it depends on what we're making. So when I'm talking about this, we're talking about our typical base malts, our Pilsner malt, your two-row malt, which I hate that term, your pale ale malt, and anything that is your base malt. For Viennas and Munichs, we'll talk a little bit how different that kilning process is. But for your base malts, you're trying to get it down to about 10% moisture before you start kicking up the temperature. If you kick up the temperature right off the beginning, you're going to start killing all of those enzymes that you just woke up in the kernel, and that'll cause some real issues for the brewers in the end. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to dry it down, trying to inactivate those enzymes. And then after we get down to 10%, then we go into the curing phase, and we try to then cook the kernel. And so that's where most of your flavor is going to be coming from in malt, is that curing phase for your base malts, is just how long and at what temperature we're actually curing it at. So for us, like for our Pilsner malt, we're about 3 hours around at 180, 185 degrees. And then for, a pale ale malt, just so our SRM for our Pilsner malt is about 1.8 to 2,
and that's the color that the SRM is a color gauge, basically, of describing how light or dark the color of your beer is going to be. So 1.2 is extremely light, and something like 80 is basically black.
Yeah, exactly. And so then our pale ale malt, which is like it's just one step up, it's basically a 5 to 10 degree difference is all the difference between those 3 to 4 hours that you're curing. You can step up throughout that process. For Viennas and Munichs, it's a little bit different because you actually want to get it down to about 20% moisture. And once you get down to 20% moisture, you're trying to keep it. You're kind of trying to stew the grain a little bit. You're trying to keep it a little bit wet as you kick up the temperature in the kiln. And that's going to produce all those melanoidins that produce those red, nice orangish red hues that you want going into your Viennas and Munichs. So it just depends on what you're doing, but typically about 24 to 36 hours is the typical curing and kilning phase.
And I have a photo up here of a large red box that looks kind of like a shipping container. Can you describe what that is?
That's our smokehouse. So yeah, we can talk about that here. That's our.
Let me go to. Do I have a picture of your kiln then? I guess.
I don't think I did send a picture. Our kiln is.
No, I don't. That's why. Okay.
It's hard to get a picture of our kiln. It's in this tiny little room because it gets so hot that we don't want to be next to it. So there really isn't. I didn't send a picture of our kiln. Our kiln is basically an 8-foot diameter grain bin is all it is, with a perforated floor underneath. And then we got a really nice heater that is all indirect heat, because you don't want propane fumes going into your malt because you use it at such large quantities in beer that the NDMAs, all the fun toxins that are produced from propane can then be transferred into the beer. So it has to be all indirect heat. And so we got a nice dryer for that, and then we can then recirculate the air at the end for the curing phase. When we're not trying at the beginning, we're trying to push all that moisture out of the grain and halt that germination. And then at the end, after we got that moisture out, we can recirculate it and cook it. And basically, we're just making a big oven at that point to bake it.
And of course, what we're describing is basically modern malting, because when you had mentioned before was you can't just go get a book and tells you all the details on how to do malting. But once upon a time, basically every brewery that was any size had its own maltings and did its own maltings, where they would buy raw barley from whatever area farms there were, and then they would
Exactly.
be in charge of turning that into malting barley that they could use to make beer with. And then when you
Yeah.
think about even farther back, when Caleb's describing indirect heat, you're not getting flavors and characteristics from your heating source. But for years, and for basically, I mean, if you want to consider from the beginning of civilization to now, most malt had characters from the heat source, whether that
Right.
be wood that we're using, where if you still go to the Franconian area of Germany around Bamberg, they still have Rauch beer, which is basically smoked beer. The malt has lots of smoke character from the oak or whatever wood they're using to dry their grains out, and that gets imparted
Yeah.
into the beer. And
Yeah.
until basically clean Coke was invented, um, either the reason that Scotch is smoky is because they burn peat to dry the malt out, and that peat character gets into the malt. It's the same with how basically all beer used to be until the Industrial Revolution, when they had other ways of coming up with malt or with drying the malt out. So, um,
Right. Yeah.
uh,
All modern beer that as we know of now is really only 150 to 200 years old. I mean, it's unbelievable when you really look back into the malting tech, because that really was what changed beer, is the malting technology, and that really didn't start changing. And we'll talk about that here in a little bit, but that didn't really start changing until the mid 1700s to the 1850s, 1870s, and after that, then beer started changing. So everything that we know of as of now is really only 150, 200 years old. I mean, it's crazy. And
yeah,
then you
and
go and you talk about yeast and all that, and and uh, clean yeast and all that kind of stuff, and that it's yeah.
yeah, and that's and if you pick up many brewing texts, especially ones that were written in the 60s or 70s, like three-quarters of the topics are about malt and malting and how brewers need to use malt in certain ways to get certain things. And then, especially from like a German perspective, you'll see like one little chapter about hops and one
Yeah.
little chapter about water and maybe one chapter about yeast, and it was all about malt and malting, and that was really the primary focus for many brewers for a very long time. Whereas
Yeah, now
now
it's
you would not know that, because most breweries that you
right.
go into, a lot of craft breweries are mostly focused on hops and maybe wild yeasts or yeast that gives you sour characteristics, or some combination of those, and it's not really a malt focus in most small breweries right now.
Right. We're
Most
trying to change that
Yeah,
though.
most small breweries are not making malt focused beers. That's not
Right.
what many consumers are looking for right now. They're looking for novel or in your face hop characteristics. And when you have that being the focus of the beer, it's difficult to really pick out the nuances of malt, because if you have those nuances, they need to be expressed in certain ways. And they're very easily overpowered by either a really strong yeast strain or dumping pounds and pounds of hops in your beer too. So,
Right.
um,
Right. But if we go back to more of the traditional historical maltings, the smoked malts and some of the unique grains and things like that, I think that's something that for craft malt, for United States craft malt has really not been explored that much. To really get back into, uh, we'll talk about that later, but to get back into where the soul of beer is malt, and to get back into that and try unique flavors, unique grains, unique processing methods. Malt, North American malt has been dumbed down for the last, since Prohibition, because all the varieties that have been bred in North America for the last 80 years, 60, 80 years, whatever it is, has been for, the big guys, and they don't want, huge flavor changes in their varieties, because if they had that, then their beer would change flavors. They don't want unique malting processes to change flavors. So I think, with these, when I started planning this malt house, there were 13 craft malt houses in North America. We're over 100 now, and growing quickly. And I think that, with that growth, and with just like craft brewing back in the 80s and 90s, we're going to start experimenting and trying new flavors and trying new grains and seeing, what they can bring to beer. But
Let's look at that one last picture. We had you had mentioned it was your smokehouse. So there's a large, like I said, a large red container with a firebox or a smoke box off to the side. Can you describe your process
yeah,
of smoking?
yeah. So we've gone through steeping, we've gone through germination, we've gone through the kilning process of making base malts. So after base malts, you have two other options. You can smoke it, or you can roast it. So we do not have a roaster currently, and I'll go in later as to why that is. But so we do have a smoker, and we actually are one of the largest. We have the largest availability of smoked malts. We have a list of 50 different smoked malts. We do fruit trees, nut trees, herbs, spices, roots. We smoke barrels. We've done, rum barrels, tequila barrels. We've done Tabasco barrels, anything like that. So what we do basically is we take our kilned grain, and as you described earlier, historically, the grain would have been dried during and smoked during the drying process, because that's the fuel that they were using. But we can't do that in our kiln, because then all of our base malts would be smoked at that point. But so what we do is we take our kilned dried grain, take it out to this smokehouse. We have I don't know if I sent you the picture of the inside of the smokehouse, but there's a rotating drum inside of it, a perforated rotating drum. We put them in 300-pound batches, put in grain in there, and then burn whatever we're burning on the outside, and do a cold smoke. We have to re-wet the grain a little bit so it absorbs the smoke a little bit easier, and then it dries back out throughout the smoking process. But that's kind of been a fun project for us, is to really bring some unique flavors into beer. Like I said, the Tabasco, and one of the biggest things that we do is lavender flower. We'll actually burn a stalk of lavender, a bundle of lavender flowers into malt, and we've had whiskeys and beers made with that. And we've done cardamom, we've done persimmon wood and plum wood, and anything you could think of, really. So
Very cool.
and then the roasting, the roasting is really where you get the majority of your huge differentials of flavor in beer. You get your caramels and your toffees from your caramel malts, to your chocolates and coffees, and really bitter black malts. So basically, all that process is for caramel malts. You take the pre-kilned, still wet germinated grain, put that into a drum roaster, and you stew the grain. You basically mash the kernel inside the roaster. You keep it at 150. You really wake up all the enzymes, start to break down the kernel, and if you have really done full modification and broken it down, you can squeeze that kernel. It'll pop open almost like a zit. It'll pop open, and all the inside, the starches and everything will spew out. And then at that point, you can start picking up the temperature and actually caramelizing the sugars that you just broke down. So that's the caramelization, crystal malts, caramel malts, all that kind of stuff. That's basically how you do it. You mash the kernel, and then cook up, and then hit the temperature, put the temperature up to caramelize and crystallize those sugars that you just produced. Roasted malts, so your chocolates, your black patents, all those kind of things, you bring in post-kilned malt, so the malt that you've already dried down in the kiln, and then you roast it just like a coffee bean, basically. You get up to 400 to 600 degrees, depending on what you're making, and that will make it, this nice, dark, chocolatey coffee flavor.
Which, when you're
And that's
talking about dried grains and temperatures that high, starts to get a little bit dangerous, right? There's a
exactly, yeah. If you look back in history, the majority of malt houses that have gone under have been because of fires. Back in the day, there was a lot of malt houses that caught fire, a lot of dust and a lot of hot temperatures, and so you have a lot of issues. So
Let's see. One question from chat: Are coffee beans a thing for beer? Well, there's certainly a lot of coffee beers, and there are certainly a lot of different ways that you can introduce coffee into beer. Either making a coffee either through brewing or cold press and adding liquid to liquid, or you can age beer directly on coffee to get the coffee characteristic. And coffee beers. I don't remember the number of entries at this year's Great American Beer Festival, but it's certainly um, a big segment. There's a lot of really cool beers that people make, either dark beers with coffee flavors, or in some cases we've made light colored beers, pale ales. I've had a Belgian wit with coffee. There's a lot of different stuff that people do. But the process is actually very similar when you get the beans to the point where they're ready to be roasted for coffee. When you're making those similar kind of malts, it's essentially the same thing. You're adding heat
Yeah,
and you're just roasting it until it gets to a certain characteristic that you're trying to get to.
yeah, yeah. And actually, there are coffee substitutes that are actually made out of roasted malts. You can go out and you can buy. Uh, if you don't want to actually use coffee, which I don't know who doesn't want to do that, but
You,
there actually are coffee substitutes that are actually made out of roasted malts, and it tastes. I've had them before. They're pretty nice. So
I've never seen that before.
yeah,
So we've talked a little bit about the history of malting. I don't. We don't need to necessarily go back to the dawn of civilization, but let's jump forward to, let's say, medieval Europe, because we've talked about some very old maltings. But um, it, like I had said before, basically there weren't malt houses in the same way. Like if you were going to be a brewer at a certain time in history, you had to understand how to turn barley into malt to make beer. There wasn't just Joe Schmo malt house down the road that you would go to buy your malts. So maybe you can maybe we can pick up in we had
yeah,
put some notes together. So small scale maltings. In this
yeah,
case, you specifically mentioned Scandinavia.
yeah. So I mean, even before, even smaller scale than a small scale malt house, a lot of it was done family by family, and that's still actually done a lot. Like I said, in Scandinavia, there are a lot of um, just family member, and malting and brewing, if you go back in a time, was typically done by the women, and that's was carried on throughout history. And a lot of the times it was done by the mom, and that the mother of the household should go out and should have it in their barn. They would do all floor malted, so they'd get, or they would, if you go back even farther into history, they did creek malting. They would actually go out and put bags into the creeks for the steeping process, or down into wells. They'd throw it down into a well for the steeping process into a bag, or in a bag, and then they would spread it out onto a floor, let it germinate just like we do now, turn it by hand, and then again, as we talked about earlier, the kilning process was very different because they didn't have coke, they didn't have propane, they didn't have electricity. So the kilning process added a ton of different flavors into the malt, and it's still found, in these small scale operations. You can still find it up in Norway and Sweden and Finland, Lithuania, and even in northern Scotland, some of the distilleries there, they still do a lot of floor malting going on there. Crisp Malt still does large scale floor malting. I toured their malt house a couple years ago, and it was really interesting. But yeah, so medieval Europe, it came from, malting came from the Middle East, from the Fertile Crescent, came up to medieval Europe, and it just kind of took off, and beer really took off in Germany and Scandinavia and the British Isles also. So
I wonder if I can find a clip of the video real quick. I use the Beer Hunter. Yeah, here we go. I use the Beer Hunter um, uh, intro song at the beginning of every episode. And let me bring this up real quick. This is some footage from a floor malting in in Bohemia, and this guy's
okay,
driving this super awesome little like truck almost, or like it's a goat cart that
Yeah.
has the augers on it. And this is footage from a floor
Oh, and
malting.
he's turning it like that.
Yeah, in the 80s, and it's this real long concrete floor, and he just drives around on this little cart, and it's electric and it's fed from like the ceiling or something like that, and he just rides around on like this little golf cart, and it's just super cool. Um, you can see the malt slowly germinating, and it's just when you get to see like stuff like that, especially in real life, it's just super cool to
Yeah.
see. And you can actually and you see Michael's walking on the malt. It's not a big deal. He's not going to damage it, and
No.
it's it does seem like it's dirty, right? It's malt. You're walking on it. It's kind of gross, but um, it's you're gonna be putting it into beer. You're gonna be
It
boiling
goes through
that
the
beer.
kilning
It's really
process,
yeah.
cooking it, kilning.
Mm-hmm.
You're boiling it in beer. It goes through all those processes. I mean, and we have rubber boots that we put on every time we get into the malt house, just to keep any dirt or anything like that, from our boots off, not getting into the grain. But yeah, I mean, it's not that big of an issue.
But yeah,
So
maybe you can put a little malt zamboni on your Christmas list. It
that
would be really really
I
small.
wish.
Maybe like a malt
I
unicycle.
wish that'd be nice. Yeah.
It'd have to be pretty small, but if you like I said, you don't get to see stuff like that in real life very often. But if you do, it's
No.
super cool because it's such a unique way of doing things, and it's such a people aren't doing stuff like that the hard way because it's
Right.
fun. They're doing it because it produces a very specific product and something that makes
Right.
really great beer. And so when you get to experience stuff like that in real life, it's super fun. So
Yeah, yeah,
um,
and like you said, it's done it's still done in many places in Europe, and then a lot of the craft malt houses that are starting up here in the United States are doing a lot of floor malting, and it definitely produces what the reasoning behind the flavor difference is still up for debate, but a lot of people think that with floor malting as opposed to pneumatic malting where the air is going up through the grain, with floor malting you have the concrete, which is cool, and the top of the grain, which is cool, and then in between that top and bottom, you have a warmer layer of grain. So you've got different levels of modification throughout that whole process, throughout that whole grain level. And with that heat, you have different microorganisms that are on that kernel of grain starting to grow. There's a lot of different ideas of why floor malted grain has a unique flavor, and I really think it's the different levels of modification between that full floor going through there that really adds a uniqueness to it.
so let's jump ahead in time a little bit. Like we said, around the in the 1700s, people started to use coke as a fuel source
Right.
for burning, and coke gave off basically clean heat that wasn't
Right.
imparting characteristics from your fuel source. So it wasn't going to be smoked malt, it wasn't going to be peated malt, it wasn't going to be malt that is flavored from your heat. You're getting clean dry air basically up through your source, and you can make very pale colored malt that does not have a smoky character to it, which is pretty revolutionary for the time.
Oh yeah, that completely changed beer at that point. I mean that's what changed what we think of beer as now today. Because everything before then was, well, before they got to Coke, they started using a lot of straw also in the British Isles especially. They would use straw. It wasn't as much of a smoky flavor. I mean, you'd still get some smokiness from burning straw, but yeah, when they started using Coke back in the 1700s, it just completely revolutionized what beer was. Because before then, it's all you get that number one, you get the smoky character, and number two, with that smoky character, you get a lot of darker colors from the hotter burning woods and things like that. So, to get a nice light pilsner malt and a light pilsner beer, you couldn't really do that before then.
And one of the
Um,
things that we discussed when we did our Pilsner episode was how all of this confluence of inventions all happen at the same time. You get
yeah,
clear glass, you get pale colored malt, you get people starting to learn what microorganisms are and isolating yeast strains. And that was basically
right.
the confluence of Pilsner. You get all this stuff together, and you can see it
Yep.
in a clear glass, and it gives birth to a whole new generation of brewing, and it was a really cool time in the beer industry.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then we go forward from there to lots of beers, especially from the English tradition of brewing, were made with large portions of brown malt. And we had already talked about drum roasting before, but maybe you can tell us a little bit more about the beginnings of intentionally roasted malt.
Yeah, so your porters and your stouts before we had a drum roaster. That was, the drum roasting was like 1820s, I think, somewhere around there is when the first black patent malt came out. Before that, they would just actually just cook the temperatures up in the kiln really quickly, and they would make brown malt. And brown malt also was called snapped malt or popped malt because during that, if it was cooked, they would cook it really quickly. And a lot of times, we started using Coke in the 1700s. They were making brown malt, in the mid 1700s. So a lot of times it was smoked also because it was still made with wood. And then they would go cook that temperature up high at the end or throughout the kilning process to get that darker flavor and darker color. I mean, but during that you lost, and they would actually use that as their base malt. Brown malt was, you would use that as your 100% base malt, but the efficiency of it was terrible, obviously, because you killed a lot of the enzymes throughout that process. So
Yeah, you had to use a lot of malt to get to a certain sugar level in your beer. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. You had I don't know what if it was double or what it was as far as getting more malt into the beer. So coming up with a drum roaster that would get a really dark malt, and you only had to use 5 or 10% of it in your beer, as opposed to doing a brown malt, you had to use all of it, but just use more and more malt to get the fermentable sugars out of it. I mean, that was another huge revolutionary process that changed beer as we know it.
Yeah, you can kind of think of it as like mixing paints. Like if you use a lot of if you have like a white paint and you put a whole bunch of really dark blue paint in there, you get a certain color, or you can add just a little bit of green and a little bit of another thing, and you kind of get to the same point, but you're using different amounts of
Right.
stuff to get to the final result.
Right.
But the other important part is that
Yeah.
the kinds of sugars that you are creating during the malting process, and then also during the mashing process too. Um, when you activate those enzymes at different levels, when you activate them at the very low temperature range, like say 145, 146 degrees, you're creating very simple sugars that are easy for the yeast to eat up and to digest. And when you go in the higher range, like up into the mid 60s, you're creating long chain sugars that are much more difficult for the yeast to eat up, and therefore you have a lot more residual sugar. And
Right.
that is also influenced by the malting process. But it's if you're if you're kind of starting with poorly modified malt or malt that does not have the same potential, you've got to use a lot more to get to that same point.
Yeah, and that's what they had to do with the brown malt. I mean, if they wanted a dark beer, that's before they had a drum roaster. Like you said, they had to use a larger percentage of that brown malt to get to dark beer. And throughout that malting and that kilning process, it killed off all the enzymes for the really high fermentable sugars. So yeah, that drum roaster, getting first of all the dark malts, and then after that they realized that they could make the caramel malts and the toffee flavored malts and all that kind of stuff, and that again, totally revolutionized what we think of as beer.
Tell us
So yeah,
tell us about the Saladin box.
so the salad, so as we talked, up until the mid 1800s, everything was floor malted. We had no and floor malting can only go to about 3 to 4 inches deep. Otherwise, it gets too hot, and you have some mold issues and over germination issues and all that kind of over modified and all that kind of stuff. So before then, everything had to be spread out in these huge floors. Go through there with a person with a rake and turn it by hand with shovels and pitchforks and rakes. And then in the mid to late 1800s, they came up with, number one, the first thing that they came up with was a pneumatic floor, which you have a perforated floor. You're blowing up air through the grain, so you can then increase those depths, 10 times as what you were at to begin with. So you have smaller space as far as for germination. And then the next invention after that was the Saladin box, which was the turners, those big augers that you showed earlier. And that was in the 1870s. And that then took out all the labor of going in there and raking it. After we got those really deep floors, people didn't want to go in there and turn that by hand. So they came up with some big augers. I think it was in Belgium, I think is where Saladin was. But big augers to turn that automatically and not have to go in there with a pitchfork and a rake and turn it. So, so that again then revolutionized, in the 1700s, 1800s, just everything changed in brewing, and it's really amazing, like you said, that time frame that everything kind of came together, and so that took malting out of the small scale malt houses and out of the towns and the family units to huge mega corporations that are making malt after that. Yeah.
So let's jump. So that's like about the mid 3/4 of the way through the 1800s. Let's jump ahead to basically the Prohibition era. So we're getting into the 1920s, and there is still a lot of diversity across the beer landscape in the U.S. And then Prohibition hits, and pretty much every brewery, except for some really big ones, have to close down. And after Prohibition, beer comes back, but it comes back in the new form that we know in the U.S. from the end of Prohibition up until about the 1960s or 70s, where everything is basically the same thing. It's industrial, light American lagers.
Yeah, and that's exactly what happened to the malting also. So as you said at the beginning of this, before Prohibition, I think in Indiana, I've done some research on Indiana. That's where we're from, so that's what I know. Indiana had about 6 to 7 malt houses, and it was brewery owned. So each brewery had their own malt house, and they were using local grain. They'd bring it in, they'd malt it, and they would go into the brewery. So before Prohibition, there was just a massive amounts of malt houses throughout the United States. Then Prohibition, just like what it did to the brewing industry, it did the same thing to the malting industry. It shrunk it down to a handful of large corporations that exist, and for the big breweries, they have their own malt houses still now. But Coors and Anheuser-Busch, they've got huge malt houses out in Montana and Idaho.
Close to where the grain.
North Dakota.
We haven't really covered this, but the North American growing regions for barley malt are mostly Canada and then the Northern Plains states, right? Idaho,
right.
North Dakota, South Dakota.
Yeah. North Dakota, South Dakota is a lot of barley's grown up there, but some years it's not. The quality isn't there because they're a little bit farther away from the mountains, so they can get into some rain issues, and we'll kind of cover that here in a little bit. But yeah, so a lot of the really like premium barley, and that's where a lot of the malt houses are still today, is out in Montana, Idaho, right on the other side of the mountains.
And of course, the idea of having the malt house close to where it's grown is that you don't have to ship it as far. It's there.
Exactly.
It's right there.
Yeah. Yep. Very cheap.
But we went from how? Do you have an idea of how many varieties of barley were used for making malt in that period leading up to Prohibition versus how many came out after Prohibition, or into
we don't really know, because barley breeding really didn't start taking place until the mid 1800s. So there was a lot of these landrace varieties that were we don't really know the actual variety of it, but there was such a huge variety of grain, but we really didn't have people actually selecting and choosing the barleys. Chevalier was one of the first named barley variety, and that was in England. I think it was an English variety, but Crisp was actually malting that now again. But that was in I think 1820 or 1830. So we really didn't have a huge variety of named barley varieties, but the difference was there. We just didn't know what they actually were. So since Prohibition, since it went down to a handful, and we're talking about North America here now, because in Europe, they never went through a prohibition, so they still have this huge variety of and history of malting and barley breeding, and it's still very active there. But here in North America, basically any barley breeding that was going on since 19, since the end of prohibition till really the last 5 years was all barley varieties grown for the big guys, and they wanted all their beer to taste the same. So all the barley that's been grown since then has been very homogenized and very straight. What they're looking for. So that's been a problem for North American malt. North American malt has been dumbed down so much that you go and say, I want 2-row malt. Well, what is 2-row malt? 2-row is the type of barley. That's not the malt. And that's just what we've come down to is all the malt tastes the same. So it doesn't matter what the variety is, and it doesn't matter what the style of malt is, because it all tastes the same. And that's one of the issues that, as craft maltsters, we're trying to overcome that.
And then we should also explain too. There are two main varieties, or I don't know what's a better way to describe it in terms of the way that barley grows. But there's 6-row, where when you look at a stalk of barley, there are 6 rows of kernels.
Yeah, I
Let
don't
me
have
see if I can bring up a picture real quick.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you look down, it looks like a star almost. It has six kernels. As you're looking down the kernel, and it's a full head, as opposed to 2-row that just has 2 rows of kernels going up the stalk. And so yeah, 6-row is a much smaller kernel.
We have a picture that we can look at.
Yeah.
6-row, you have literally 6 rows of kernels growing around the stalk, and 2-row, you have 2 rows of kernels.
Right. And so yeah, like I said, with that, your 6-row, you have more kernels in the head. So there's the kernels are usually smaller. Because they're competing with each other. So you don't have as plump of a kernel. You're not getting as much starch. So your starch to protein and enzyme levels, you're actually getting more protein and enzymes out of your 6-row. And that's why a lot of distillers like 6-row, because they're using corn and other non-malted grains, and they get a higher enzyme content out of 6-row typically when they're trying to ferment unmalted grains, as opposed to 2-row, which is and everything in Europe is 2-row barley. So your Pilsner malt, your Vienna malt, your pale ale malt from England, it's all 2-row. So those are a larger kernel, more starch, more fermentable sugars out of that, and better for all grain brewing, basically.
So that brings us basically up to right now, with the idea of craft malting or small scale malt houses that are. Would you say that the focus tends to be not only on, I guess, just producing a certain product, but is there also a lot of interest in heritage varieties in terms of barley that you see across your segment?
Yeah, there is. I think kind of at the beginning of craft malting, we're only. I think the oldest craft malt house was started in 2012. I think I can't remember who we're less than 10 years old. I mean, we're a very new industry. And like I said earlier, we're over 100 now producing in the United States and Canada. But at the beginning, we were very much about trying some of these heritage varieties. But if you think about it, there are reasons that those heirloom and heritage varieties aren't around still. So whether it was poor efficiency in the brew house, whether it was poor agronomic for the farmer, we found another grain that has surpassed that in both agronomically and in the malt house and in the brewery. That being said, like I said earlier, Europe has never had issues. They never had the prohibition that halted basically all barley breeding and halted all of the progress that they made. So a lot of these European varieties are actually very flavorful, have great profiles in the brew house. And so that's kind of a lot of the craft malt houses now are trying, like that's what we're doing. We're growing German varieties here in Indiana. And we found they have just great flavor, really great in the field for the farmer. They get really great yields, Um, malts really well, um, gets really good extract and really good flavor out of the malt. So yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely some interest in heirloom varieties, but they have to, number one, make as much money for the farmer because the farmer's not going to want to grow it if the yield's half of what it is.
Yep.
And number two, get good extract, good runoff times, good flavor for the brewer. Otherwise, it's not worth. Yeah, it's a 100-year-old variety, but after that, there's no story. I mean, there's a story behind it, but there's no economic and flavor difference as far as that. So,
And those of you that have been here with us for the hops discussion, you're probably hearing some very similar things where you come up with a new variety, and no matter what flavor or character you get into the beer, if it doesn't make sense for the farmer and it doesn't make sense for the processor, then there's no point in going through with it because it's just
right,
a giant waste of time. It's going to be,
right,
if it's a waste of money and it can't be profitable, then it doesn't matter if it makes the best beer in the world because it, people have to make a living doing this. And when you get to agronomics and you get to growing something, it's a very different prospect from just pulling something off the shelf. So
right. Now, Maris Otter is the one variety that goes against all those. Malt houses pay farmers more for Maris Otter in England, and I think they grow it in southern Scotland also. Because of the demand for it. It doesn't produce agronomically as well as some of the more modern varieties, but brewers just love it. So that is kind of one that goes against what I just said, I guess.
but you have to make that up on one way or the other. Either you're going to pay more for it, you're going to pay a premium for it, even if it's not as agronomically sound. But the demand has to be there, which is
Exactly.
pretty big important. So.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, there might still be varieties out there that we can either maybe not necessarily use as that specific variety, but we can use it in a breeding program, and that's what a lot of Cornell, Ohio State University, Oregon, I think it's Oregon State is, and then Montana, Minnesota. A lot of these universities are actually doing a lot of breeding programs, trying to come up with new varieties for the craft brewing world and craft malting world, to bring some of these European flavors over into North American varieties and have them grow well here. So who knows? But it takes 10 years for it to go from a 2 by 2 meter by 2 meter test plot to a field that we can actually make a beer out of. So it just we have a lot of time to figure out what we can make.
So let's talk about actually growing malting barley. First of all, what's the difference between just some run-of-the-mill barley that would be used for feed versus malting barley? What are the characteristics?
Yeah, so you have to, from the beginning, you have to choose for a malting variety. There are feed varieties of barley and there are malting varieties of barley, both in 2-row and in 6-row. So that doesn't, I mean, 6-row, a lot of 6-row is feed barley used for feeding animals, but you can also have malting 6-row. So that doesn't that's not the difference. The difference is, number one, we're looking for low protein for brewing. For feeding animals, obviously, we want higher protein. So we want low protein. We want good yielding for the farmers. And then the other big thing is disease control. So there's a thing called it's deoxy. I don't remember the exact full name of it, but it's a vomitoxin that you get from Fusarium head blight. Is a good indication that you're going to get it. And it's a vomitoxin that can, number one, create gushing in beer, and number two, it's called a vomitoxin for a reason. If it's in high enough levels, you can actually get sick from it. So that's a huge thing that malt houses screen for, and it can only be, we won't accept it above 0.5 parts per million. I mean, it's a very small. If it's even in the grain, it won't go into malting. So disease control. The correct climate, as we talked earlier. Indiana is not a great climate for growing barley, and that's why some years we get really good barley, some years it's not so great. We have to get it from other areas. But the climate, barley loves cold nights, dry. When it's ready to be harvested. So a lot of the malting barley that is grown now has shifted from the east, in the early years to the Midwest, and then shifted all the way out to Idaho and Montana because they have irrigation, they can put as much water as they want on it, and then when they want the grain to dry down, they just turn the water off, and it dries down, and it makes great barley.
One of our friends in chat was saying that the west side of the state is in a drought condition today in South Dakota. Uh,
Yeah.
just um, how real quick, how different are the growing conditions in Europe, which is obviously a generalization, versus the growing regions in North America?
So you have the British Isles, which obviously are going to be cooler and more moist as far as humidity and rainfall and all that kind of stuff. Or not humidity, I guess, but more rainfall. And then you have the continental European varieties that those are more similar to our Midwestern styles. And that's why we started growing German and Czech varieties, because in southern Bavaria and Czech Republic, they have pretty similar summers with high humidity, high heat. Barley does not like the humidity. So Don, that vomitoxin I was talking about, actually comes from after a really heavy rainfall. It comes from the soil. It's a fungus that splashes up from the soil onto the head and onto the kernels of the grain. And then if it's humid after that, then that starts growing on the kernel. So as far as growing climates, you have these varieties out of England that are more adapt to the cooler, wetter conditions, and then you have the southern Bavarian and Czech Republic varieties that are more adapted to the hotter, humid climates. So bringing that over to the United States, that's why here in the Midwest we started growing. We try to do like Maris Otter and some of the English varieties, but our heat and humidity just destroyed those grains. Number one, Maris Otter is also a winter planted variety, so it's planted in October, and then it overwinters and starts growing. But our winters are so much colder here, it kills it over. It's called winter kill. It'll kill the grain. It'll kill the plant. I mean, so because the British Isles, with the climate that they have, they don't get as cold as we do here. So they don't really overwinter here as well. Now, compared to the German and Czech Republics, they get some varieties that are grown in higher altitudes, things like that. Those actually overwinter pretty well for us here. So for the Midwest, we try to use the continental varieties. I know a lot of craft malt houses on the East Coast, they are trying to use some of the English varieties because they grow well there. And then when you go to the main barley production in the United States, out west, basically you can grow anything there because they can kind of control their conditions. So they do spring varieties, they do winter varieties, and it comes from everywhere.
You had talked about molds or other issues with growing. Somebody in chat was asking about pests and parasites. I know in hops there are definitely mites and other insects that can affect growing. What about in barley?
So barley is mostly molds in the field. The pests come in during storage, and we've had issues with that. Everybody has issues with that if you're not on top of it. So there are things called weevils, and you can get those even in your flour or any grain stored in your kitchen. They have this little snout that comes out of them. They'll burrow into the kernel, lay their eggs, and then they just hatch out, and they'll eat it from the inside out. I mean, they just destroy the kernel. So yeah, the pests really come from storage, because when you think about malting, we're all harvesting it as opposed to hops. They dry those down and it's all packaged and ready for the whole year. We're storing the raw barley throughout the year and malting it, every single day we do a new batch. So you have to keep that raw grain in condition for it to be malted. And with temperature fluctuations and things like that, sometimes the bugs will hatch out and you don't expect it. This year, I had a farmer grow barley for us, and he had some great barley. And we had a really, really hot August, September, and usually we have a cool August and September, and the bugs don't hatch out, but they hatched out, and he didn't catch it in time, and he lost 10,000 bushels of barley basically because of that. So yeah, the storing and keeping it in condition during storage is a huge thing for barley. But you'll get some pests in the field, but typically what we're in the Midwest here, especially, more worried about are the molds and funguses.
So we've got it grown, we've got the location grown, we've got it in the field, we've got it malted. Um, uh, and we used to do that. Well, I guess there's still a lot. There's still a number of really large North American maltsters, but what specifically when we talk about craft malt? Although this is so new, what are the general parameters that you guys are kind of using as an industry segment to describe yourselves and to characterize yourselves?
Yeah, so we do have a guild. I don't know how old the guild is, maybe 5 years. We do have a guild, and in that guild, if you're a craft malt house, it's locally grown, and that means at least 51% of your final product is grown locally. Now, what locally is, that can be debated. We define here Sugar Creek, we define local as a 200-mile radius of us. So wherever our malt house is, we try to get all of our growers within that 200-mile radius. So number one, locally grown. Number two, small scale, less than 10,000 tons a year. We're producing about here 500 tons or 500 tons a year. We've still got a huge way to go on that. But the malt house that you showed pictures of up in Wisconsin, I'm sure they can produce in one batch basically what we can do in a year. I mean, I don't know what scale they were at, but a lot of these large scale malt houses are just massive. We produce 3,000-pound batches. That would be a small, tiny percentage of what they do. And the last thing, just like a lot of the craft brewers are trying to do now, is the independent seal and everything is independently owned. So those are the main parameters as far as craft malt. But those are the definitions of us. What we're trying to do is really bring back, like I said, a lot of the European flavors into North America. Bring unique flavors like what we're doing with the smokehouse. And really try to bring back malt flavor into beers instead of the hops and the yeast, because that's what craft brewing now is so focused on, is hops and yeast. But there's so many different flavors in malt that we don't explore right now that can be explored.
And then just for purposes of scale, we have a 30-barrel brew house at the brewery. And so when Caleb's talking about making 3,000 pounds of malt in one turn or one batch through the malt house, we can make basically we could make somewhere between 1 and 2 batches of beer with that amount of malt, and that literally means one pass through the brew house. So we're only talking about 30 to 60 barrels of beer for that amount of malt. So it's a relatively small amount because now I work at a much smaller brewery, but when I worked at Three Floyds, we would do 8 to 10 turns a day of batches of beer, and that would be 1,500 to 2,800 pounds of malt per batch. So
Right.
much larger scale.
Yeah.
We have a question here from chat. Excuse me. What about within your industry segment, or how are you guys carving out a niche in terms of customer base, and are you even a blip on the radar of some of the big companies like Monsanto or some of the big multinationals?
No, I don't think so. Not yet. But like I said, our industry is very much like what the brewing industry was in the late '80s, early '90s. We're very young industry, and who knows what's going to happen. We have a lot of, just like brewing did back then, we have a lot of consistency issues. We have a lot of quality issues, and we have to get all those figured out before we really become a huge. I mean, we can produce in our malt house at full capacity. We can produce about 1 million pounds in a year. And that's one of the bigger craft malt houses in our industry. I don't know many other craft malt houses that are producing as that much as far in North America. And I've done research on we try to source our grain within a 200-mile radius, and we try to sell our grain our malt within a 200-mile radius. And within that 200-mile radius, it's something like 25 or 30 million pounds that are used in that 200-mile radius of malt. We are very, very tiny percentage of that. Now, once the industry keeps, like as I said, 3 years ago there were only 13 craft malt houses. Now there are 100 and some craft malt houses. Who knows what'll happen here in the next 10 years? It's really if we can get everything really and work as an industry together, then maybe we will kind of make some of the bigger malt houses kind of worry. But as of now, we're such a young industry, we have no idea.
So when you got the idea to do a startup, I kind of have laughed at this idea about how many people are trying to start small scale hop operations because the capital that you need to get that up off the ground is pretty intensive. Let alone one of the things that we described or talked a lot about in the hops episode was when you have a hops processing facility, you're only using that once a year. At least
Right.
the business model is a little bit better with a malt house where you can do maltings basically all year long as you can control your ambient temperatures to some degrees. But what are some of the things that you needed to consider when you were doing your startup?
Well, that's kind of the reason that, as I said at the beginning, I wanted to get back into the agriculture world and in the brewing world, but I didn't want to do hops because of that reason. You build this whole facility and you use it once a year. Number one, number two, if you're advertising as local hops, you can't go buy hops out of the West Coast and say, hey, we packaged it in our packages and now it's local hops. Malt, on the other hand, is a value-added product. We're making a new product out of barley. So the Midwest is not a great hop growing community or area. It's not a great barley growing area. Last year, luckily, we produced about 85 to 90% of all the grain that we malted was within our 200-mile radius. Some years it's not going to be that. And that's kind of one of the reasons we wanted to go into malting is that even if we can't produce a high quality barley that we can make malt out of here in the Midwest, we can still get barley out of the western states and make an Indiana product, to make a local product. So that's the reason that we got into it. So after we figured out, all right, we're gonna malt. It's okay. Where do we get the equipment? When we started this malt house, there was nobody making equipment for small craft on the size that we were craft malt houses. There were a couple in Germany, but by the time you buy it and get it shipped here, it's going to cost you 20 years to get it paid off. So from the get-go, just like brewing back in the 90s, we had to use equipment from different industries and make it work for us. So our steep tanks are actually used to hold corn syrup out of a corn gluten manufacturer. Our germination floors we custom designed and built. Our kiln we custom designed and built. And then our seed cleaning and all that kind of stuff comes from corn, and soybean cleaning processing plants. So it wasn't like we go out and number one, buy all the equipment. That doesn't exist. So we decided that we figured out what we're going to do, that we're going to malt. And number two is figuring out what kind of malting system. So as we talked, there's floor malting, which is a separate steep, a separate germination spread out on the floor, and then a kilning process. And then what we decided to do was a pneumatic system because we didn't have as much space that we could spread out during germination floor malting. So we did a separate steep, a separate germ with pneumatic system, 2 feet deep beds, and then a kilning process. They're also now that the craft malting industry is taking off, there are companies making all-in-one systems that you load the grain in, it steeps, it germinates, it kilns, all in one system. So that was another option that we could go down. But the issue that we had with that is that you can only basically do one batch a week, because if it's all in that one system, you're steeping, you're germinating, you're kilning all in that one system. So it's tied up for that entire week. And was like $500,000 just for that one piece of equipment. What we can do is we put that amount of money in all of our building, our seed cleaning, processing, everything. It's that same amount of money, and we can start a new batch every single day because we're emptying the steep tank into the germ floor. So as soon as the steep tank's emptied, we can put grain in. It germinates. As soon as it goes into the kiln, we fill the germination floor back up, and vice versa. So we're able to produce about 6 or 7 batches in a week, as opposed to an all-in-one system, which is one batch a week. Um, the other issue that we ran into was nobody knows how to deal with us. As craft malt houses, malting has not existed in Indiana since before Prohibition. So you call the local health department, you call the local ag department, the State Department of Agriculture. They have no idea what to do with us. So some states, Michigan for one, has they've put just crazy limits on what the malt houses can do. And as we talked earlier, malt is considered a raw product, and they've made it all food grade. Can't touch anything besides stainless steel the entire time, which makes no sense
Wow.
because the huge mega malt houses, they germinate on concrete
Mm-hmm.
and all this kind of stuff. So Michigan has all these crazy laws, and so it's totally by state and by your local authorities,
They
I
probably
guess.
don't
So
even let you keep your guns in your malt.
I know, right? We have to store them somewhere else. So. Um, but yeah, and I've got on the list of here the other things that are literature. There's no literature for malting. All the after Prohibition, all the malting went to. It's all taught in house. So the big malt houses, they'll get apprenticeships, and it's all taught in house. So there's really, you have their stuff in the brewing books that kind of cover malting, but it really doesn't go into recipes and things like that. So it was all trial and error for us. It was trying to figure out how to use our equipment and how to make a Pilsner malt and how to make a pale ale malt out of that using that equipment. So trial and error. And there are two schools that you can go to, and they're only like 2 week long courses on malting. So there's no like formal education for malt houses for maltsters. There's no real good literature for maltsters, and it's all just put a bunch of money into this and hopefully it works. And that's kind of what we did. So
We have a question from chat. So, what do you do if something in your process goes bad or you don't get to the finished product that you're looking for?
luckily, the malt house is close to the hog farm that I said I was raised on. So any bad batches go to hogs, and you're eating it in your bacon. So yeah.
Um,
So yeah, I mean, just like a brewery, if you guys have a bad batch that doesn't meet your specs, you dump it, and that's what we have to do in the malt house.
mhm.
If we have a bad batch, we don't sell it because that just gives a you know bad name for the malt house. So
So we've
yeah,
talked.
luckily we have a good all of our waste goes to feed animals. So
So we've talked a lot about the challenges, and the big boys can pump out a very consistent product. But what are some of the advantages to buying malt from a small house like yours?
yeah, I mean, so number one, you're supporting your local farms. That only goes so far for me. And I get annoyed with that with some of the breweries too. You support local. Yes, it's great supporting local, but you have to have a quality product, number one, and number two, something unique. And that's what we're really striving for here is to try to produce and that's what we've done the last 2.5 years is really trying to nail our base malts down. Is to just get a nice Pilsner, a nice Pale Ale, a nice Vienna, get those really nailed down and dialed in. And then after that, really start experimenting with different flavors. And that's what we started doing with the Smokehouse. And in 2018, we're going to come out with, we're building another germination floor that we're going to do rare grains. And we're going to do, for the brewers, limited release malts, like you guys do limited release beers. We're kind of playing on that. And we're going to do things like corn, things like sunflowers, things like sorghum, and anything you can think of, any grain you can think of. We're going to germinate that batch, do a 3,000-pound batch, pull 300 pounds off of that, smoke it, pull another 300 pounds off of that 3,000 batch, make a caramel malt out of it, and then pull another 300 pounds off of that and make a chocolate or a black malt out of it. So every quarter, every month, we haven't decided what we're going to do on it, but we're going to have a limited release malt that is going to be a rare grain, even some ancient grains like amaranth and einkorn, things like that. We're going to try to do a rare grain, malt it as a base malt, and then have your caramel malts, your chocolate malts, and your smoke malts, and you can produce a whole beer out of that rare grain with that range. So I think that's, as far as why use craft malt, local, number one, because that's great. But number two is and that's an industry problem that we have in the craft malt is consistency, number one, from batch to batch, and consistency from year to year, because we're using locally grown. We don't have hundreds of farmers to choose from. I have 6 growers that grow for me, and we do contracts with them. And if if their barley doesn't make quality, then I have to get it from somewhere else. And so that's a big struggle for the craft malt industry is getting quality barley to begin with, especially here in the East Coast. It's just not a great growing climate for it. So consistency is something that we're striving for, but really just those flavor profile differences that we can make as a small scale malt house, just like a small scale brewery. We can experiment and make unique flavors. So yeah, I think being able to collaborate and talk to your brewer, talk to your farmer, and say, hey, we want to grow this, we want to malt it this way. That's the huge advantage of using small craft malt house.
So what is you've already talked about some of your immediate plans for Sugar Creek, but what about some big picture stuff? Uh, Obviously, if growing conditions have to be very specific or within a certain range, how is climate change, or how are different weather patterns affecting what the future might hold for North American barley?
It's going to be interesting. 2 years ago, North American, the big growing climates, up in Canada and North Dakota and Montana, they had really wet harvest conditions, and they lost a lot of grain then. This year, same thing happened in Europe. So it's going to be interesting, as we warm up and as the climate changes a little bit, where's the malting barley going to go? And I don't know, did you guys talk about that in your hop episode about, I think they're having some of the same issues with some hop production areas, is that they're coming up with problems that they haven't had for years. And so it's going to be interesting, do we go from having these really hyper local, or not all centralized in the West Coast where all the barley's grown, spread it out to, what we're doing and making it a local product. And you're going to have some variables year to year, but, pretty similar at that point. So, it's going to be interesting to see what happens here in the next 20 to 30 years as far as where all the malting barley is grown, because I think we're going to see a huge change here soon with that. So I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, we can't grow everything in Alaska. Alaska's big, but
I know.
can only go so far. We're going to run out of globe. We can't not have beer. That clearly is not the same.
Exactly.
It's not really on the table for potential future plans. So
yeah.
What about anything that we didn't cover that you wanted to make sure that we got a chance to touch on?
I don't think so. Unless you have any other questions.
Chat, do we have anything else that we want to ask Caleb before we wrap up? I'm super excited about the ability to try to get some of those flavors. You and I had worked on a project before at my previous brewery where we had one of those German heritage varieties, and you were able to bring over a small amount, do some maltings, and we made a beer with it. And it was that quintessential German malt character in the beer that you really just can't get from anywhere else. Even if you're getting malts from Germany, I think because that heritage or that variety had just a certain, it has a certain taste, a certain malt character, and it's so unique to that specific variety, or to the way that they treat that variety once it's harvested.
Yeah,
I think just very difficult to replicate.
Yeah, number one, the malt house is where the majority of the flavor comes from the malt. Obviously, how you treat the barley as you're malting it. But there's definitely differences in flavors that we've noticed even in the last 2 years, changing from this flavor to that flavor, or from this variety to that variety. There are definitely flavor differences in the varieties. It's not as drastic as hops as you have, but there's definitely a difference there. And yeah, kind of exploring those different varieties and seeing what they can bring to, your really low-key beers as a pilsner or a pale ale malt, or not even pale ale really, but some of your English style beers and German style lagers, those different varieties can make a huge difference in the end product. So
Yeah, I mean, when you're talking about the backbone of your beer, of when you're sitting down and doing recipe creation, that's typically one of the very first things that you decide is what is my base malt going to be, what is the final
Right.
character that I'm trying to get with that base malt, and you go from there. And so
But
if you don't have that 100% confidence in what you're using,
right.
then you're already starting off on the wrong foot.
But how many brewers that you can talk to, if you ask them what barley variety they're using, how many can tell you? I mean,
Probably not
that's
very many because
right.
you're
As
looking at a
opposed to
cat.
hops. I mean, every brewer can tell you exactly what hops they're using.
Yep.
But as far as barley varieties, it's just like I said, the North American malt houses have just dumbed it down so much that it's two row barley. That's all it
Yep.
is.
Um,
And so to get back to those varieties and seeing what flavor differences there are in those varieties is huge for the craft malting world. I
yeah.
mean, that's and for in the craft brewing world. I mean, if you're gonna, you're seeing a lot of yes, right now it's a lot of really hoppy IPAs, but we're starting to see a lot of going back to really just easy drinking lagers, and to really make different flavor difference profiles, and that is to get some of these European varieties and trying to see how they malt for us. So I'm excited for that. I
Yeah.
mean, it'll be fun.
Yeah,
But
when you're looking through a catalog from one of the big malt purveyors, um, if you see a named variety like Optic or Maris Otter or Golden Promise, those aren't typically American grown varieties.
no,
You're not seeing Voyage or Scala or Teepee or Harrington or the other North American grown hop variety or malt varieties because
yeah,
they're not first of all they're not publicized. If you want to know what they are, you really have to do a lot of research, and
right,
not very many people have a direct relationship with their maltster in that way where they're telling
right,
you, yes, this is the specific variety of barley that is being grown that you're using. It's more often presented as here are the parameters in
this
terms,
is what you have.
yeah,
Yep,
here's your proteins, here's your all the way down the line, and that's what you're looking at. You're not looking at what's behind all those numbers.
right, yeah. But you said TP and Scala, and those are some of the malts, the varieties that we malt here. Those are actually German varieties that we brought over here and started growing here. Voyager is something different. That's a North American variety. But yeah, TP and Scala are two of those varieties that a lot of the craft malt houses are growing because they grow well in the Midwest because they are German and Czech Republic varieties, and they just do well here for us. So, but yeah, as far as North American malt houses, they do not you don't know what variety you're getting. It's they just label it as two row, and I just think that's a cop out, I guess. I mean, it's if you have as a brewer would go and say, hey, I need aroma hops, and they would just say, here are some aroma hops. This is what you get.
Yeah.
That's not a
Or
how's
you go to a taqueria and you say, I want taco,
right.
and they
Yeah.
just look at you like, cool. What kind of taco would you like? Well, I just want taco.
Yeah. Yeah, that's one of my biggest pet peeves is when brewers are like, I just want two row barley. Well, okay. That's what do you want me to malt it into? Because
Yeah.
two row barley is a barley. What do you want me to make the malt into?
Mm-hmm.
So, but anyway.
Cool. Well, if we don't have anything else, and I don't see anybody else jumping out with questions, Caleb, I sincerely appreciate you joining us. I think this was really great, and I look forward to our projects together in the future, and the cool beers that we're going to make with the cool malts that you're going to provide for us. If anybody in chat is interested, I'll pull up Caleb's information again. Sugar Creek Malt down in Indiana. And you guys tell me again what city you guys are near, or
Lebanon, Indiana. So we're about 30 minutes north of Indianapolis. We're right off the interstate. I mean, we're like 4 minutes off of 65. So if you're going from Chicago to Indianapolis, you're going to drive right by us.
so if you guys ever want to check out what a super cool small malting facility is like, Caleb can, I'm sure if you get in touch with him, he'd be more than happy to show you around in all of his free time.
Yeah.
Actually,
Somebody will be here.
before we
Somebody
leave,
will be here. You can just come in and just have a beer and then tour yourself. But yeah, no, we'll be here. So.
before you leave, why don't you give everybody maybe you can give us a little clue about how the last couple months for you have been.
It's been rough. So we've barley is harvest. Our barley here is harvested in June and July, and so we get our barley harvested, and then end of July we get our samples back to know what the varieties or what the protein levels are and the vomitoxin levels are and all that stuff. So we bought 10,000 bushels in August. Thought it was going to do great. Had some serious mold issues after it started germinating, so we had to dump that. We had another farmer down in Kentucky that we were going to buy some barley from. We got that in. Was doing great with that, and then that's the one that I talked about. He had some bugs hatch out in the bin. We lost 10,000 bushels there. I tried to get some barley out of Michigan. It was promised to be great, and we had some issues there. So it just we've had. I think I'm on plan F or G or wherever I'm at right now with this, as far as trying to find our barley. So it's been a rough last couple months, and during those couple months we've had trucks break down and our air conditioning unit and our germination room break down. It's just been one thing after another the last few months, but we're finally back on track right now. So
it's all the joys of owning your own company and being your own boss, right?
Exactly. Yep. There are good months and bad months, and we've had a few bad months in a row. So hopefully we'll have some good months now. So.
I think it's also a testament to American farming ingenuity and the stock of people that come out of that lifestyle, right?
Yep.
You can't.
Yeah,
you're probably not going to.
You gotta roll with the punches. So
yeah.
I mean, if you're wanting to get into craft malting, you can't just bow over and say, well, we're done. So we got to figure out how to do it and figure out a way to make it happen. So
awesome. Well, with that, everybody, thank you for joining us, and we will see you next month. I don't know what the topic is going to be yet, and since it's December, everything's a little bit crazy with the holidays, but maybe we'll do another beer episode where we get some cool holiday beers or just some beers in general and just chill and drink some beers and chat about them and see what's up. Again, my guest this month has been Caleb Michalke of Sugar Creek in Indiana, and thank you guys all for joining. And if you check in on the channel later in December, I should have details on what next month's topic's going to be. And if you pay attention to my Twitter account, it'll get tweeted out on there as well. So thanks everybody for joining, and we'll see you guys later.
Cheers.